Good evening. It is fitting, I think, to begin this evening with a prayer, so I will recite the blessing offered by Pope John Paul II at the beginning of Veritatis Splendor. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. The splendor of truth shines forth in all the works of the Creator, and in a special way in man, created in the image and likeness of God. Truth enlightens man's intelligence and shapes his freedom, leading him to know and love the Lord. Hence the psalmist prays, "Let the light of your face shine on us, O Lord." In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Welcome to all of you. Welcome, President Kilpatrick. Welcome to the faculty who are here. Welcome to students and all the guests this evening. Tonight's lecture is sponsored by the Center for Law and the Human Person, so I'd like to say a couple of brief words about the center. I'm privileged to serve as director of the center, which is now in its third year of programming. The mission of the center is to be a central resource for the law school in connecting the Catholic intellectual tradition and the dignity of the human person to the study and the teaching and the practice of law. So in furtherance of that mission, we do things like sponsoring symposia and lectures like tonight's event. We support scholarly research and curricular development, and in particular, we emphasize student formation. So outside, you may have seen we have flyers of upcoming events. You can sign, you can add your email address to be informed of upcoming events, and you can visit our website for videos of past events and to learn more about the center. This year, we have chosen the theme of freedom for the center's activities. In interdisciplinary fashion, we will examine freedom in law, but also in other contexts, such as philosophical, theological, political, medical. This theme of freedom is relevant to many contemporary challenges to a Christian understanding of the human person, and especially in the context of American law. In our contemporary culture, freedom is understood to be a state of independence from external authority, and the sovereign autonomy to decide what is good and even what is true for oneself. As the Supreme Court put it in Casey, at the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. So throughout all of our events this year, we hope to engage this modern understanding of liberty and to offer a corrective, one that honors not just choice, but choosing the good. One that seeks not radical liberation from external authority, but rather one that recognizes and even delights in the fundamental dependence of freedom on truth. This theme is especially fitting because this year we celebrate the 30th anniversary of Veritatis Splendor, Pope John Paul II's encyclical letter on the splendor of truth. It was during my own law school years that this great encyclical letter was released. I've kept my old copy. It cost $2.25 at the old Notre Dame Ham's bookstore, and I've treasured it all these years. In this encyclical, Pope John Paul II explores the relationship among law, freedom, and authority in light of man's ultimate end, eternal life. He reminds us of the enduring importance of natural law, that light of understanding infused in us by God, that law written on our hearts, which expresses our participation in the very mind of God, and thus the profound dignity of the human person. The natural law, by virtue of its immutability and universality, allows us together to tackle difficult, contested moral questions while avoiding sectarian, partisan wrangling. The richness of this Catholic intellectual tradition continues to provide guiding light for scholars, including budding lawyers, and I was eager that a new generation would be introduced to the elegant, compelling witness of the splendor of truth. And I could think of no better scholar than tonight's speaker to do this for us. So a brief introduction, and then I'll welcome you to the podium. Father Aquinas Guilbeau, a native of Louisiana, entered the Order of Preachers in the Dominican province of St. Joseph in 2005. After several years of pastoral work in New York City, he began doctoral studies in moral theology at the University of Freiburg, Switzerland, where he completed a dissertation on St. Thomas Aquinas' doctrine of the common good. Before arriving at Catholic University, he taught moral theology at the Dominican House of Studies, just across the street, where he also served for a time as prior of the community. Earlier this month, Father Aquinas was appointed by President Kilpatrick as the university's first vice president for ministry and mission, and he also serves as our university chaplain. His presentation this evening is entitled, "What is Freedom For? A Reminder from Veritatis Splendor on its 30th anniversary." Please join me in welcoming Father Aquinas Guilbeau.
Thank you, Professor Kirk, for that kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming this evening. Pope John Paul II signed his 10th encyclical letter, Veritatis Splendor, on August 6, 1993. That month I began my senior year of high school. It was also the month of World Youth Day, Denver. The next year, I entered the seminary. Little did my 17-year-old self know then how important this encyclical would become for me, for my study as a seminarian, for my preaching as a priest, for my teaching as a professor. My whole religious life and priestly ministry has unfolded beneath the mantle of this encyclical's instruction. And the encyclical's importance, I'm happy to report, endures. Not just for me, but for the whole church. 30 years after its publication, Veritatis Splendor remains the most comprehensive magisterial expression of the essentials of Catholic moral doctrine. For that reason, the encyclical merits our continued reading and study. As Christians, we should aim to be clear in our thinking and especially in our speaking about the moral life. And we have no better guide for our moral thinking and speaking outside of the Catechism of the Catholic Church than Veritatis Splendor. I'm grateful to the Columbus School of Law and its Center for Law and the Human Person for inviting me to speak this evening on Veritatis Splendor. As with the university altogether, we mark the encyclical's 30th anniversary. Thank you, Professor Kilpatrick, and also, again, Professor Kirk, for the kind invitation to speak this evening. Pope John Paul begins Veritatis Splendor by observing, as we just heard a moment ago, that truth acts as a splendid light. Truth, he says precisely, shines forth in all the works of the Creator, and in a special way in man, created in the image and likeness of God. Because all that exists is created, the Pope notes. All that exists participates in and radiates the truth of the Creator. This reality is especially important for the highest of earthly creatures, the human creature. The Pope explains in the very second sentence of the encyclical, truth enlightens man's intelligence and shapes his freedom, leading him to know and love the Lord. The splendor of truth is not only for God to see, but also for man to see. But God seeing the truth and man seeing the truth are not the same. God basks divinely and eternally in his own truth. He is the truth. He is truth. Man is not his own truth. As a creature made in the image of God, man never exhausts truth. His imaging of God can always become truer. something that comes to man from outside of him. Truth enlightens man's mind and frees his heart, so that as the means to becoming a truer image of God, man might know and love the Lord. In the first two sentences of Veritatis Splendor, Pope John Paul highlights the mystery upon which he will reflect over the rest of the encyclical. Truth elevates the human mind, and in so doing, truth expands and frees the human heart. Truth lifts. Truth frees. Truth lifts persons. Truth frees persons. To many of us here this evening, the Pope's initial observations in Veritatis Splendor are self-evident. We see their truth clearly and do not deny them. Truth elevates, truth frees. End of story. But to others here this evening, maybe the Pope's opening observations are not so self-evident, and therefore admit to some denial. To such persons, it may not be so clear that truth elevates minds. It might be even less clear, or contrary to experience, that truth frees hearts. The secular world certainly disputes this latter claim. In fact, entire schools of philosophy arose, many in the 18th and 19th centuries, around the denial of freedom's dependence on truth. Thinkers in these schools reimagined anthropology and subsequently politics and economics around a conception of man liberated not by truth, but from truth. What does truth have to do with freedom, if not to suppress it, they asked. Man is free before truth, they insisted. Man's freedom must be protected from truth, they warned. Even if the question of truth and freedom raised by these schools was not always honest, we as Christians owe the question an honest answer, which is why Pope John Paul II wrote Veritatis Splendor, and why as Christians we should study his answer carefully. The Pope knows that by separating freedom from truth, one, quote, goes off in search of an illusory freedom apart from truth. Freedom separated from truth is not, in fact, free. It is yoked to an illusion. Only freedom shaped by truth remains true freedom. That's the message, the teaching of Veritatis Splendor. As a loving father and a patient teacher, Pope John Paul II lays out the problem in this way. Today, he writes, it seems necessary to reflect on the whole of the Church's moral teaching, with the precise goal of recalling certain fundamental truths of Catholic doctrine which, in the present circumstances, risk being distorted or denied. Under pressures from some modern philosophical claims, the Pope explains, fundamental moral truths go unrecognized or even denied by contemporary men and women. What's worse, the Pope continues, these same fundamental truths are sometimes denied by Christians themselves. In fact, the Pope writes, a new situation has come about within the Christian community itself, which has experienced the spread of numerous doubts and objections of a human and psychological, social and cultural, religious and even properly theological nature with regard to the Church's moral teachings. What do these doubts and objections look like? It is no longer a matter of limited and occasional dissent, the Pope observes, but of an overall and systematic calling into question of traditional moral doctrine on the basis of certain anthropological and ethical presuppositions. The Pope laments that modern and sometimes attractive, to be sure, conceptions of man, but drawn neither from the greater philosophical tradition nor from the gospel, are being used even by pastors, theologians, and believers to dispute fundamental truths of the greater tradition and of the gospel. The various anthropological and ethical presuppositions often supporting these denials have one thing in common, the Pope argues. At the root of these presuppositions, he writes, is the more or less obvious influence of currents of thought which end by detaching human freedom from its essential and constitutive relationship to truth. Not only does the Pope object to the modern decoupling of freedom from truth, he also regrets that believers within the Church have adopted this separation into their own thinking, especially when considering moral questions. For the Holy Father, the results of this adoption of the separation of freedom from truth, even in Christian thinking, are distressing. The traditional doctrine regarding the natural law and the universality of the permanent validity of its precepts is rejected, the Pope laments. Certain of the Church's moral teachings are found simply unacceptable, and the magisterium itself is considered capable of intervening in matters of morality only in order to exhort consciences and to propose values, in the light of which each individual will independently make his or her decisions and life choices. We see these results lamented by the Pope all around us, in the public square, in art and entertainment, in our families, among our friends. Truth may be treated as a guide to freedom, but in the end, truth may be rejected in every situation where exercising choice appears preferable to accepting a demand. Before examining in greater detail Pope John Paul's argument in Veritatis Splendor, it might be helpful to look briefly at some of the history behind the encyclical. It is important to note that the Polish Pope was not the first successor of St. Peter to confront the challenge of modernity, and in particular, its reconception of freedom. John Paul himself admits as much in the opening paragraphs of the encyclical. He recalls that defense of the authentic understanding of freedom has been a preoccupation of the Church's pastors for the last 2 centuries. 1993, 1893, 1793. 200 years brings us back to a particularly bad year of the French Revolution. It is the year that the terror started. No doubt the French revolutionaries' appeal to terror in service of liberté stood for John Paul as an icon of the modern misconception and misapplication of freedom. The Church's concern with getting freedom right goes much back further than the 18th century, however. To be sure, the question of freedom as a general matter is as old as human thought itself. Ancient Greeks and Romans, as well as ancient Buddhists and Confucians, developed theories of the ends and means of freedom. For their part, Christians took up the question in the Church's earliest days as integral to their reflection on the incarnation of Christ and of the Paschal mystery. Freedom appears in the teachings of Jesus, of course. If the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed, the Lord says in St. John's Gospel. After the resurrection, the apostles did not fail in their witness to Christ to develop a doctrine of freedom. Live as free men, yet without using your freedom as a pretext for evil, writes St. Peter in his first letter. For freedom, Christ has set us free, declares St. Paul in his letter to the Galatians. These New Testament texts became the touchstone of Christian reflection on freedom. The Church Fathers and the medieval scholastics, followed by the Fathers of the Council of Trent and the preachers and teachers of the Counter-Reformation, reflected deeply on the authentic ends of freedom and the proper means to it. Rooted in the teaching of Christ and the apostles, the considerations of freedom by the Fathers, the medievals, and the Counter-Reformers represent an authentic development of doctrine as their writings reflect the questions and concerns of their respective ages. It goes without saying that the 18th and 19th century revolutions in North and South America and in Europe raised for the church and for humanity the question of freedom with a new urgency. Freedom posed not only an academic problem, but also a practical one. Freed from the yoke of ancient law and political custom, had modern man become actually free? And if he did, how should modern man maintain his new freedom? Reigning at the end of the age of revolutions, and still a self-sentenced prisoner of its effects in Rome, Pope Leo XIII took up the question of freedom with special pastoral care. He wrote several encyclicals on freedom and liberty in an attempt to revive the ancient and Christian notion of freedom for a world boastful of its new freedom, which turns out, in fact, to represent, in Leo's view, a false and counterfeit freedom. Throughout his efforts, Pope Leo pleads not only for Christians, but also the whole world to see again the inherent link connecting truth and freedom. The link between truth and freedom forms the cornerstone of Pope Leo's 1888 encyclical, Libertas, to highlight just one of his writings on the topic. The end or object both of the rational will and of its liberty is that good only which is in conformity with reason, the Pope writes toward the beginning of Libertas, repeating the classical principle. The human will remains truly free, the Pope recalls, when it freely chooses the true good. Pope Leo spends the rest of Libertas applying this principle to confronting the false notion of freedom advanced by more radical forms of political liberalism. To this end, Pope Leo underscores the connection between freedom and truth by defending the connection between freedom and law. Again, his argument takes a classical shape. Insofar as law is a precept of reason for the common good, law is a necessary means by which truth informs and guarantees freedom. By imparting to the mind knowledge of the good, law, when promulgated, received, and followed, ensures that the free actions of citizens accord with right reason. The nature of human liberty, Pope Leo writes, however it be considered, whether in individuals or in society, whether in those who command or in those who obey, supposes the necessity of obedience to some supreme and eternal law, which is no other than the authority of God. Simply stated, God's truth secures human freedom. Or in Pope Leo's words, the eternal law of God is the sole standard and rule of human liberty. Pope Leo then fills out the picture of truth, law, and freedom in a familiar way. As within human affairs, the natural law and human law communicate to men and women the wisdom of the eternal law, natural law and human law participate in the authority of the eternal law. And in communicating authoritatively to men and women knowledge of the true good, natural law and human law play their respective roles in securing and measuring human freedom. Pope Leo concludes Libertas by applying the measure of true liberty as he has outlined it to the new liberties advocated and promoted by liberal societies: liberty of worship, liberty of speech, liberty of the press, liberty of teaching, and liberty of conscience. Pope Leo insists on evaluating and applying these liberties according to the true measure of liberty found in the inherent links connecting truth, law, and freedom. it is important for our study of Veritatis Splendor to recall the teaching of Libertas, especially Pope Leo's efforts in the encyclical to lay out the inherent links connecting truth, law, and freedom. The connection between truth and law and freedom is exactly where John Paul takes up the question of freedom in Veritatis Splendor. In this way, the two popes share a similar project and a similar approach. If Pope Leo defended authentic freedom against the liberalizing tendencies of the modern state, Pope John Paul defends authentic freedom against the liberalizing tendencies of modern theology, especially modern moral theology. The aim of both popes is to show against new efforts to separate truth and freedom how, in fact, truth and freedom belong together. Certain tendencies in contemporary moral theology, John Paul writes, under the influence of the currents of subjectivism and individualism, involve novel interpretations of the relationship of freedom to the moral law, human nature and conscience, and propose novel criteria for the moral evaluation of acts. Although the negative tendencies of subjectivism and individualism may take on several forms in contemporary thought, in their functioning they have one common effect. Despite their variety, John Paul writes, these tendencies are at one in lessening or even denying the dependence of freedom on truth. The rest of Veritatis Splendor stands as a response to this trend. If we wish to undertake a critical discernment of these tendencies, the Pope writes, we must examine them in the light of the fundamental dependence of freedom upon truth, a dependence which has found its clearest and most authoritative expression in the words of Christ, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. It is here that, following the example set by Pope Leo, John Paul introduces the link between freedom and law to defend and promote the link between freedom and truth. Man is certainly free, John Paul observes, and he possesses an extremely far-reaching freedom. Far-reaching does not mean uncontrolled, however. Man's freedom is not unlimited, the Pope writes, for it is called to accept the moral law given by God. Why? The law of God. Pope John Paul explains, human freedom finds its authentic and complete fulfillment precisely in the acceptance of that law. God, who alone is good, knows perfectly what is good for man, and by virtue of his very love, proposes this good to man in the commandments. John Paul recalls that the divine knowledge of the human good passes from God's mind to man's mind through law. Accordingly, God reveals the commandments to man not to constrain his will, but to expand his mind as to the true nature of the human good and human happiness. As a result, commandments and law do not inhibit man's freedom, but instead engages and broadens it. God's law does not reduce, much less do away with human freedom, the Pope writes. Rather, it protects and promotes that freedom. This last point of Pope John Paul II, which stands as a central teaching of Veritatis Splendor, should appear as good news to everyone, and in particular to the law student, and to anyone as well involved in the work of a law school. The Pope goes on to great lengths to feature law's quality as a mediator between truth and freedom. On the one hand, law observes the natures of things and gathers from them a wisdom for living. This is the contemplative quality of law. Law observes and takes its direction from how things are. In this way, law obeys reality. Law serves truth. On the other hand, law gathers what it learns from how things are and translates that knowledge into precepts that coordinate the activity of a people, which coordination aims at freeing persons from any number of obstacles that prevent their participation in the common good. In this way, law promotes freedom. Law serves freedom by ensuring the social and political conditions necessary for persons to live according to right reason. And this freedom to live rightly and reasonably, true liberty really consists, according to Pope Leo. It is in serving truth and in serving freedom, mediating between truth and freedom and joining them, that law enjoys its nobility and high dignity. And it is from the high dignity and nobility of law itself that the profession of law, service to the law in all of its forms, attains its own dignity and nobility. Ministers of the law, servants of the law, or for that reason also ministers of truth and ministers of freedom. Before closing these reflections this evening, I would like to say something about encyclicals in general. Rarely when writing encyclicals do popes compose complete, comprehensive texts, despite their length. Instead, popes make brief pronouncements on a topic. They state conclusions that are to be held by the faithful, often without providing a complete argument in support of the conclusions. Popes might indicate the kind of arguments that could be developed in defense of the conclusions, but rarely do they themselves give fully fleshed out arguments. This doesn't mean that the encyclical's conclusions are incorrect, or that we accept them only on plain authority. Instead, the literary form of the encyclical invites bishops, pastors, theologians, and the faithful in general to fill in the arguments themselves. By writing encyclicals, popes for centuries have spurred theological reflection and even theological innovation in the Church by reaffirming the conclusions to discussions in which pastors, theologians, and the faithful are engaged or should be engaged. In this way, encyclicals possess a kind of proto-synodal quality. We see an example of this in both Libertas and Veritatis Splendor. In these two encyclicals, Popes Leo and John Paul respectively distinguish between true liberty and false liberty. They defend the former for its conformity to nature and grace, and they denounce the latter for its incongruity to nature and grace. And while each pope rests the conclusions of his encyclical on this distinction between true and false liberty, neither offers a full description of it. As a result, each pope leaves us to wonder, where does this distinction originate? What is at its heart? On what feature of liberty does false liberty differ and oppose itself to true liberty? And why should we care? Why is freedom so important to get right? What is freedom for, that it receives such attention in philosophy and theology and papal statements? These are important questions to answer in order to understand better the conclusions about freedom that the popes Leo and John Paul defend in their encyclicals. These are important questions, too, for the Church and the world generally. What kind of world existed in the late 19th century that required an encyclical like Libertas? What kind of world exists today that requires an encyclical like Veritatis Splendor? What were the true and false notions of freedom circulating then? What are the true and false notions of freedom capturing imaginations now? Because the popes themselves do not answer these questions fully in their encyclicals, they invite us, when reading their encyclicals, to pick up these questions and answer them. One theologian who has explored these questions in depth is the late Belgian priest, Father Servé Pinckaers. Father Pinckaers was a Dominican friar and a moral theologian who taught for most of his career at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland. He died in 2008, 2 years before I arrived in Fribourg to study. It is still widely said that Father Pinckaers was one of the several ghost writers that Pope John Paul used when composing Veritatis Splendor. If this is true, then Father Pinckaers was a good choice. For decades, he had studied and taught about the Christian moral life, and he became an expert particularly on the place that freedom holds in human action. Father Pinckaers was one of several figures in the mid-20th century to renew both intellectual and pastoral interest in the scriptural, patristic, and medieval appreciation of the transformational dynamism of a Christian life rooted in the virtues, the Beatitudes, and the gifts and fruits of the Holy Spirit, which unfortunately since early modernity had been overshadowed by a simpler but more legal approach to the Christian life rooted primarily in the Ten Commandments. Father Pinckaers saw in his study of the modern shift from a virtue-based approach to the Christian life to an obligation-based one no mere shift in theological or philosophical preference or nuance. At the heart of this historical shift, Father Pinckaers observed, was a change in anthropology, a shift in the understanding of the human person. Specifically, the shift involved a change in the common understanding of how, within the human person, will relates to intellect. For the ancients medievals, will appeared as the appetite of intellect, so that the will naturally desired and was stirred by the goods presented to it by intellect. Freedom then was understood to be, in addition to representing a quality of choice, the overall ability to desire the good well and to pursue and enjoy promptly and easily the goods that perfect us. To some modern thinkers, however, this view of the relation of will to intellect appeared to constrain, or worse, coerce, free choice. Therefore, in an effort to protect and even prioritize freedom in human action, these thinkers saw the will as distinct from intellect, such that will no longer incline naturally to the goods presented to it by intellect, but as a manifestation of will's freedom, stood indifferent to the goods presented to it. The will is most the will, these thinkers concluded, when it moves to the good not as a result of desire or passion or inclination, but only as a result of free choice, and not because by nature or grace or any other means orients will to the good. We not need get into the weeds of this debate. I want to highlight only that Father Pinckaers perceived this distinction between two kinds of freedom, what he called the freedom for excellence and the freedom of indifference, to lie at the heart of the drama of modern moral philosophy and modern moral theology. Father Pinckaers described the modern freedom of indifference in this way. Freedom lay entirely in the power of the will to choose between contraries, and this power resided in the will alone. It was the power to opt for the yes or the no, to choose between what reason dictated and its contrary, between willing and not willing, acting and not acting, between what the law prescribed and its contrary. Thus, freedom consisted in an indetermination, or a radical indifference in the will regarding contraries, in such a way that actions were produced in a wholly contingent way. Freedom was essentially the power to move in two opposite directions. It was qualified by an indifference to the opposites. Correspondingly, Father Pincair's described the classical freedom for excellence this way. Here we find a freedom that presupposed natural inclinations and takes root in them so as to draw forth strength needed for their development. Every person possesses basic moral inclinations and a primal moral sense that no corruption due to sin can completely destroy. The natural root of freedom develops in us principally through a sense of the true and the good, of uprightness and love, and through a desire for knowledge and happiness. Far from lessening our freedom, such dispositions are its foundation. We are free, not in spite of them, but because of them. The more we develop them, the more we grow in freedom. Nature does not restrain human freedom. Nature is essentially liberating. It produces spontaneity in the spiritual order. Thus, founded on a natural sense of goodness and truth, freedom is no longer characterized by indifference, but rather by the spontaneous attraction and interest experienced in regard to all that is true and good. The morality issuing from this freedom is a morality of attraction, not obligation. Again, we need not get into the weeds of the distinctions between these two descriptions of freedom. My aim in highlighting this key feature of Father Pincair's scholarship is to show how, prompted by papal admonitions regarding the conflicting notions of freedom and morals, particularly in politics, Father Pincair's bore down to the heart of the issue. He uncovered what he thought to be the source of the conflict, a radical change in the common view of how will relates to intellect. He studied that modern anthropological and ethical presuppositions that John Paul signals as leading moral philosophy and moral theology astray. In so doing, Father Pincair has produced throughout his scholarship an anthropological lens through which to read encyclicals like Libertas and Veritatis Splendor. When studying these encyclicals through Father Pincair's interpretive lens, we can appreciate how each pope in his own way, to different audiences and in different circumstances, calls his readers to resist the temptation to live indifferently, with all of its consequences, and instead to pursue the adventure of living excellently, with all of its consequences. Pope John Paul puts it this way in Veritatis Splendor: human freedom belongs to us as creatures. It is a freedom which is given as a gift, one to be received like a seed and to be cultivated responsibly. It is an essential part of that creaturely image which is the basis of the dignity of the person. Within that freedom, there is an echo of the primordial vocation whereby the Creator calls man to the true good, and even more, through Christ's revelation, to become his friend and to share his own divine life. It is at once inalienable self-possession and love of the other. Freedom, then, is rooted in the truth about man, and it is ultimately directed towards communion. The good news that Veritatis Splendor leaves us is this: freedom is for something. The human will does not stand indifferently before the good. Instead, the human will stands longingly before the good, impatient for the freedom necessary to pursue the good, and desirous of the excellence necessary to enjoy the good. St. Augustine got it right centuries ago. The human heart remains restless when it sees God, and it remains restless until it rests in God. In Veritatis Splendor, Pope John Paul II reminds us that God has constituted the human person in mind, heart, and passion for a lifelong earthly adventure, the pursuit of the good. And it is for this adventure that God providentially unites truth, law, and freedom to furnish us with a splendid and joyful path to follow toward not only our earthly good, but also to our everlastingly splendid and joyful end, when in glory we shall see truth face to face and love him freely forever.